For decades, air combat was about speed. Faster jets, faster turns, faster reactions. The pilot who could push harder, turn tighter, accelerate faster, that pilot won. That era is ending. The change didn't announce itself. There was no single moment when speed stopped mattering. But across theaters, across conflicts, across quiet engagements that never made headlines, a pattern emerged. Pilots with slower aircraft were winning, not sometimes, consistently. And the reason had nothing to do with courage, skill, or aggression. It had to do with something far more fundamental. They saw first. This is not a story about a single weapons system. This is about a shift in the nature of combat itself. A shift so profound that it is rewriting not just how air forces fight, but how they think. And it begins with understanding why speed ever mattered in the first place. In the early years of air combat, speed was survival. World War I pilots in fabric biplanes learned quickly that whoever controlled velocity controlled the engagement. Dive on the enemy from above, strike before they can react, escape before they can turn. The concept was simple. The execution required nerve, but the principle held. Speed bought options. It bought escape routes. It bought the chance to dictate terms. By World War II, this had calcified into doctrine. The faster aircraft could choose when to engage and when to disengage. The P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, the Messerschmitt, each designed with speed as a primary advantage. Maneuverability mattered, yes, firepower mattered, but speed gave a pilot the ability to refuse combat on unfavorable terms. And in a domain where refusing combat means survival, that was everything. Then came the jet age, and speed became an obsession. The sound barrier fell in 1947. Within a decade, fighters were reaching Mach 2. The faster you could go, the more prestige you carried. Speed became synonymous with capability. The F-25 could reach Mach 3.2. It was a propaganda triumph. Never mind that it could barely turn at that speed. Never mind that its engines would destroy themselves if pushed too hard. It was fast, and fast meant superior. This belief was so deeply embedded that entire design philosophies revolved around speed. The F-104 Starfighter was built like a missile with a cockpit. Its wings were thin as knives. It could accelerate like nothing else in the sky. It also killed a staggering number of pilots, because speed without context is just velocity, and velocity without awareness is often fatal. But the mythology persisted. Faster aircraft would outrun missiles. Faster aircraft would dictate engagement range. Faster aircraft would dominate the battle space. This was the assumption, and for a time it held, until it didn't. The problem with speed is that it operates in a linear dimension. You can only go so fast before physics, fuel, and human tolerance impose limits. A pilot pulling 9 Gs is on the edge of blackout. A jet at Mach 2 burns fuel at extraordinary rates. And no matter how fast you go, you are still constrained by the speed of light, the speed of sound, and the speed at which a human brain can process information and make decisions. That last constraint is the one that matters most. A human being, even a highly trained fighter pilot, requires time to recognize a threat, assess options, and act. That time is measured in seconds, sometimes fractions of seconds, but it is never zero. And in the compressed decision space of modern air combat, those seconds are everything. Because while you are processing information, someone else may already be acting. This is where speed begins to fail. In the 1960s and 70s, radar-guided missiles began to extend engagement ranges beyond visual distance. A pilot could now be targeted before ever seeing the enemy aircraft. Speed could not prevent this. You cannot outrun a missile if you do not know it has been fired. You cannot maneuver if you do not know from which direction the threat is coming. And you cannot decide to disengage if you do not realize you are already engaged. The equation changed. Speed no longer guaranteed initiative. Detection did. Radar technology evolved faster than propulsion technology. By the 1980s, airborne early warning aircraft could track dozens of targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 200 miles. Surface-to-air missile systems could engage aircraft at altitudes and distances that made visual identification irrelevant. The battle space became a geometry problem, not who was fastest, who saw furthest. And this introduced a new form of lethality: information asymmetry. If one side knows where the enemy is, and the enemy does not know where they are, speed becomes irrelevant. The informed side can position, wait, and strike at a moment of maximum advantage. The uninformed side can be fast, maneuverable, and aggressive, and still die without ever understanding why. This is not theoretical. This has happened. In 1982, during the conflict over the Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, Israeli aircraft engaged Syrian fighters and surface-to-air missile batteries. The result was lopsided. Dozens of Syrian aircraft destroyed, minimal Israeli losses. The difference was not speed. Syrian MiGs were fast. The difference was not courage. Syrian pilots fought. The difference was information. Israeli forces had integrated their radar picture, linked their aircraft, and created a shared awareness that allowed them to see the entire battlefield simultaneously. Syrian forces were fighting individually, each pilot aware only of what his own sensors could detect. And in that gap between collective awareness and individual perception, the battle was decided. This was a revelation, but it was also a warning. Because if speed no longer guaranteed dominance, then the entire structure of air combat doctrine needed to be rethought. And slowly, quietly, it was. The concept of sensor fusion began to take shape. Instead of a pilot relying solely on his radar, his eyes, his instruments, sensor fusion meant integrating data from multiple sources into a single, coherent picture. Your radar, your wingman's radar, an AWACS aircraft 100 miles away, a satellite overhead, a drone orbiting the battle space, all of it combined, all of it presented to the pilot as one unified view. This sounds simple. It is not. Fusing data from different sensors, different platforms, different frequencies, all moving at different speeds and angles, requires extraordinary computational power. It requires standardized data formats. It requires networks that can transmit information in real time without latency. And it requires trust. Because a pilot must be willing to act on information that did not come from his own eyes. That last part is harder than it sounds. Pilots are trained to trust their senses, to trust their instincts, to verify before committing. But in a sensor-fused environment, there is no time to verify. The system tells you there is a threat at a specific bearing and range. You must decide in seconds whether to believe it, whether to act, whether to fire. And if you hesitate, you lose the initiative. This is the time compression problem. Modern air combat happens faster than human perception can fully process. Not because aircraft are moving faster, though they are, but because the decision loop has collapsed. Detection to engagement, engagement to decision, decision to action. The entire sequence now happens in a span of time that would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. Subscribe, like, and share for more. Consider this.